Hi everyone, Salim Barahmi here, the director of PIBD, with another episode of Dardashe, a series where we talk at length with inspiring and amazing Palestinians about their lives and career. Today we're joined with Professor Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, and the author of many acclaimed books, most recently The 100 Years' War in Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. Professor, it's great to have you with us. How are you doing?
I'm fine. It's good to be with you.
How are you keeping sane and busy during these surreal times?
Well, we fled New York after many weeks of lockdown to be with my daughter's family in Chicago. So I have two little grandchildren to keep me busy here.
That's good.
School year has not finished, so I have school work, university work. And when the pandemic hit, I was in the middle of a book tour, which was obviously interrupted. So I've been doing, as of the last couple of weeks, a number of virtual book events, and that's been keeping me very busy. And it's very encouraging that people are interested enough to watch through Zoom. So that's been good.
Yeah, that's great. And congrats on the new book.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to start, I guess, back in the early days. You were born and grew up in New York?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And what I heard you say on one of your interviews that your first exposure to Palestine was around the dinner table with your father, who worked at the UN.
Right.
What was that like? What did you get from those conversations? And I guess also your father was in a sense an advocate for Palestine at one of the biggest international forums, very early on. What was his experience like as well?
Well, he was involved with the United Nations from its very inception. He had been a radio broadcaster during the war for what was it? Whatever was the predecessor of the Voice of America. He did his war service, in other words, broadcasting. And then he broadcast for the United Nations, and then he worked in the Human Rights Division. And finally, he ended up in Political and Security Council affairs. And it was when I was a kid, he would come home and talk about what had happened in the Security Council. His section of the Political and Security Council affairs, which is now Department of Political Affairs at the UN, was tasked with following the Middle East. And the Middle East covered 50% of the work of the Security Council in all of those years. So they were very busy, and everybody else was sort of sitting around doing very little comparatively. And so he would come home and describe this stuff. And we spent every other year in Beirut, the summers, and Palestine and Jordan, visiting with family. We had what the UN gave us, what was called home leave. And then my father's job included assignments abroad. So we went to Libya for a few years. We were in Korea for a few years. We were in Beirut a lot of the time. So I was traveling at the same time. I mean, I was born and grew up in New York, but I spent until I graduated high school, half of my life on the road somewhere, living somewhere else, sometimes in the Arab world and sometimes elsewhere. And in all of this time, I was following things that the behind the scenes, and what al kawalis type stuff at the UN through my father. I mean, I would meet these people who worked at the UN. I would meet these ambassadors as a kid, or rather, I would listen to my parents talking to them. So I was following the Palestine question from when I was a little kid.
And was it then you were inspired to pursue that as a career within academia, or how did that happen?
Yeah, my father was very insistent that I not do history or political science, which is what he had done. And he went on to get a PhD actually in those fields. And he said, no, you don't do that. Do medicine, do law, do engineering, do science, do anything else, but don't do this. And of course, young youth being youth, I never listened to my father. I mean, I tried to, I tried to appease him, but in the end, I ended up doing what I wanted to do, which was to follow this course that he himself had followed.
Yeah, it took you to Beirut eventually in the 70s, and that was almost somewhat of the heyday of the PLO, and also the beginning of its downfall in some ways. To where it is today. What was that like? What was your time in Beirut like during that time?
Well, my mom was Lebanese, And after my father passed away in 1968, she moved back to Beirut. She left when she was a little kid. She'd come to the States with my grandmother and my uncle. But she went back to Beirut as soon as my father died. So from the 60s, my home was in Beirut, even when I was still at college. And then later when I went to Oxford to graduate school, I would be in Beirut, both for research and because my mother lived there and my brother was there and so on. My brothers actually were there. And we have a lot of family in Lebanon. I mean, from my father's family, people who took refuge there in 1948, or people who were married to Lebanese families. And then my mother's side, my mother's family. So, I mean, for me, Beirut is a place I've always known. We would go there and to Jerusalem and to Amman on home leave in the summers. But I actually have probably as much family in Beirut as in Palestine, not even counting my mother's family. So I was sort of at home in a way in Beirut. And you're right, it was the era when the PLO was beginning to establish itself, first in Jordan, and then after Eylul Aswad, after Black September, moved to Lebanon. And I was living there at that time. I was in Beirut. We had an apartment from 1972, actually. I had my own apartment in Beirut from 1972. So I was not just living with my mother, I was now living on my own, doing my research for my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation in Beirut. And I obviously became involved in politics. I had been involved in politics even before that. I became much more deeply involved when I was living there. So I sort of was present at the creation of the PLO's state within a state in Lebanon. I was intimately aware of the problems that were caused between Palestinians and Lebanese, and between Lebanese. All of the episodes of the war, from the 1973 attack by the Lebanese army on the refugee camps, through the actual outbreak of the so-called civil war in April 1975, we were there. I was actually working in Tel Zata. We were doing a project in Tel Zata the morning of April 13th, when the war began with an ambush of the bus going through Ain al-Rumani. So I was a witness to these things and involved, obviously. And so, and we didn't leave until 1983, until the end of the summer of 1983. So we lived through, I and my wife and our children later on, lived through the first 10 years of the war, from when it started with us in 73 through the 75 to 83 part of the war, including the Israeli invasion of 1982 and the siege of Beirut.
I want to dig deeper on this, the thing you mentioned, the state within the state. I think the PLO had something similar within Jordan as well, and I think the structures of the politics, of the patronage, of the distribution of money. I think as a Palestinian who grew up in the West Bank in the Oslo era, a lot of that resonates with me today, and the politics I think we inherited from that era. Do you think those structures, I mean, first, what were they like in Beirut, and how much did they contribute, I think, to the destruction a bit of the PLO and the national movement from inside?
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger on something that not many people, except Lebanese and Palestinians who were there, are fully aware of, which was the extent of the PLO's involvement in Lebanese politics. It became more and more involved. Even before the PLO came under attack, first by the Lebanese army, then by what became the Lebanese forces militias, then later on by the Syrian army, and then later on, and by Israel in 1978 when they invaded the south, and then in 82, and constant attacks from the 60s onwards, late 60s onwards. And this was partly a defensive reaction. In other words, the PLO felt itself, we as Palestinians in Lebanon felt ourselves under attack. We were actually under attack. That was not a paranoid perception. But the behavior of the PLO contributed to the problem. The divisions within the PLO, the manipulations by Arab governments of small factions within the PLO, which were out of control of the PLO. Several small groups. Jabhat Tahrir al-Arabi, Jabhat Tahrir al-Falastini. I mean, minuscule fractions that had absolutely no popular support, but were basically fronts for the intelligence services of Libya or Syria or Iraq mainly, were a constant problem. As was the kind of patronage, you mentioned patronage, as was the kind of patronage that Fatah and its leadership engaged in vis-a-vis Lebanese factions of the national movement. There was this uneasy alliance between the Lebanese national movement, headed at that time by Kamal Jumblat before his assassination, and the PLO. Because there was an understandable basis to this, which was that both of us were under attack from some of the same enemies. Certainly the Lebanese forces, the Kataib, the Phalangist Party, the National Liberals, and so on, were very much opposed to the Palestinian presence in Lebanon, and were very much opposed to the national movement. As was, over time, Syria, for different reasons, as was obviously Israel, as was, we now know, the United States. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, in the 100 Years' War, is material that's available now in the Foreign Relations of the United States series of diplomatic documents on the Middle East, which show the extent to which Kissinger was deep, and the United States were deeply involved in this front, creating a front against the PLO, as part of its larger diplomacy in the Middle East. Camp David, before Camp David, the disengagement agreements with Egypt and Syria, which the PLO, both of which the PLO opposed in different ways, or at least saw as steps that harmed it. And so Kissinger was deeply involved in organizing these things, in getting the Syrian army to come into Lebanon and preventing the Israelis from reacting. They came in against us. They didn't come in to fight Israel. They came in to fight the PLO. So all of these things led the PLO to react in a defensive manner that was extremely negative in terms of its impact on the Lebanese, because they came to see that the PLO was dominating parts of Lebanon, which it was, that it was lording it over the Lebanese, which it was, that it was in control of things, which it was, that it was more disciplined and powerful than the Lebanese national movement, which it was. And they didn't like this, understandably. Israel and the Lebanese forces and Harakat Amal and other actors eventually took advantage of this or reacted to this. So we were in trouble, as it were. We as Palestinians in Lebanon, or the PLO in Lebanon, was in trouble. But to some extent, the PLO got itself into that trouble.
Yeah.
And I see what you say about those patterns and those habits carrying over later on. This, of course, is to some extent understandable in wartime. You know, you're fighting a war. To some extent, any means are acceptable. It's a matter of survival. The problem is these corrupting tactics and this overbearing attitude in non-war situations is completely unacceptable.
Yeah, it's completely monopolized power and control over different parts of Palestine. So different factions have used the same policies, and we've become one-party systems in different parts of Palestine without a larger system that many more Palestinians around the world and even in the West Bank and Gaza can participate in. And it's extremely alienating. And you can see the roots of that coming from Lebanon and Jordan, right, in the 70s and 80s.
Well, I mean, the only thing that can be said is that in the situation that obtained in the 60s and 70s, first of all, you had multiple groups that balanced Fatah. And secondly, within Fatah, you had individuals who balanced Yasser Arafat. So you had Abu Iyad, and you had Abu Jihad, and you had a few other leaders of Fatah, and you had George Habash, and you had Naif Hawatmi, and you had a few other PLO leaders, such that the kind of untrammeled, authoritarian, one-man system that has developed in the Palestinian Authority and the PLO since 1982, or since Oslo, if you want, had not yet developed. I mean, Arafat was first among equals, and people could and did stand up to him and object. And there were people in the Lebanese national movement, Kamal Jumblat most notably, but others also, who could stand up to him. So you didn't have this infirad, this single-handed individual control of everything that later on developed. Now, that changed for...
Was it decision-making by consensus back then when you had a lot of these?
Basically, yes. Basically, yes. I actually wrote a book on the decisions to leave Beirut in 1982 when they decided that they had to leave, the PLO had to leave Beirut. This was not Arafat's decision alone. It was taken over a long period of time in debates within Fatah, within the PLO, and between the PLO and its Lebanese allies. And even Lebanese leaders who were not allies of the PLO, Saib Salam and the Prime Minister and so on and so forth. It was not an individual decision. And that was true of most of their decisions in the 70s and up until they left Beirut. Things changed after Beirut. I think they got much worse. And they got much worse for multiple reasons. George Habash became sick. He had a stroke. He ceased to be the presence and the power he was. The PLO was separated from its mass base in Lebanon and in Jordan. It was rooted among the Palestinian population of those countries. And it had local support among Jordanians and among Lebanese, even as it was alienating other Jordanians and other Lebanese. In Tunis and in Algiers and in the places that they went into exile, they had no base, they had no mass base. So that's one problem. They were cut off from their people. Second problem is that the best were being systematically liquidated, assassinated, mainly by Israel. There's a wonderful book about this, Rise and Kill First, by a former Israeli intelligence guy by the name of Roland Bergman, which is a horrific account of the murder, the assassination, they call it targeted killing, of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the best and the brightest among the Palestinians. Obviously not just political leaders, intellectuals, writers, and so on. Kamal Nasser, Hassan Kanafani. I mean, you know, the list goes on and on and on. From the 70s. In fact, the book goes back before the 70s, but certainly from the 70s and going until the present, with assassinations of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Jabhat Shabiya leaders and PFLP leaders. So we had that. And they didn't take out the dumbest and the worst. They took out the best and the brightest. They took out the people who were important. So they took out Abu Jihad. Somehow Mahmoud Abbas survived. They took out, I could go on and on and on. I mean, the people they killed in April of 1973, Kamal Nasser, Kamal Adwan, Abu Yusuf Najjar, these were important figures in Fatah. Abu Iyad, Abu Jihad, the two most important leaders of Fatah after Arafat, and the two people who could stand up to him and who he had to listen to without exception, and so on and so forth. So you had that process, and it was not just the Israelis. You had at least 3 Arab governments involved in systematic assassinations of PLO leaders through their intelligence services operating through nominally Palestinian groups like Abu Nidal or others. So the Libyans, the Iraqis, and the Syrians were systematically helping the Israelis, in fact. And that led to a situation where Arafat was without restraints by the time you get to Oslo. There was nobody who could stand up to him.
Yeah, during the period of the 70s and talking about Oslo, there was the 10-point plan or program that was issued in 74, I think, if I'm not mistaken, which was... That's
correct, yeah.
The first...
Mrs. Dawatani of 1974.
Yeah, it was the first, I guess, strategic shift in articulation of a strategy of establishing a base on part of the land. What do you think led to that, which I think eventually culminated in Oslo, but why was that pivot taken then?
Well, think of the year. What was 1974? 1974 was a year after the October War, the 1973 war. The 1973 war marked Syria's acceptance of Security Council Resolution 242. Egypt and Jordan had already accepted it. It marked a war for limited objectives. Limited objectives meaning the Arab states were not fighting to restore the situation before 1948. The Arab states were not fighting to restore even the partition plan of 1947. The Arab states were not fighting for Palestine. The Arab states were fighting to reverse the losses of 1967 insofar as Egyptian and Syrian territory was concerned. Jordan was not involved in the 73 war, and it was not, well, it sent troops to Syria, but otherwise it wasn't involved. So basically Egypt and Syria decided that they were limiting their objectives to restoration of the territories occupied in 1967. This left the Palestinians out in the cold. This meant that the Arab states were no longer even nominally, even verbally, claiming to be fighting for the right of return, to be fighting for restoration of the territories that were taken in 67, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They left. And the second thing that happened after 1973 was that each Arab state, Syria and Egypt, negotiated separately with Kissinger disengagement agreements, such that there was not even an Arab front. Arafat and Abu Jihad came to a group of us once in, I believe it was 74, and told us that they had been in a meeting in Egypt where Sadat had told them that he had basically deceived the Syrians about how far the Egyptian army would go into Sinai. And when they queried him, why have you done this? He said, they got us into the trouble of 1967. Why should we? I'm not quoting verbatim. I have it written down somewhere. So you already had each Arab state acting on its own and playing the game that Israel and the United States wanted, which was to allow the Americans and the Israelis to do a bipartite negotiation. The Americans and the Israelis ganging up on one Arab state at a time. So Hafez al-Assad and Anwar Sadat fell into that trap. In addition to which, they basically dropped the Palestine question. And we saw the most clear evidence of that by the time of Camp David, when the Egyptians basically abandoned the Palestine issue. They signed an agreement with Begin, which is the basis of Oslo, which is sovereignty belongs exclusively to Israel. There are no limits on settlement. There is no Palestinian statehood or sovereignty. There will be some autonomy for the people, but not for the land. Egypt signed off on that. I mean, that the United States and Israel would agree on it is one thing. Egypt signed off on that. So what's happened in 1973 and early 1974 puts the PLO in a situation where we now have all of the key Arab countries having taken a course of a peaceful resolution of the conflict, having disengaged their forces from Israeli forces in Sinai and in the Golan Heights. The two major Arab armies, the Iraqis have not now and never have been, were not then and never had been a major factor. Jordan was not a major factor. So the two main Arab armies had basically been removed from the chessboard. So, I mean, a change of strategy was necessary. You could have either gone against all the Arab governments, taken a revolutionary path, and taken a very dangerous and adventurous path, and said, you have to do something about Palestine. Or you tailor your policy and say, we accept some kind of negotiated settlement. The problem with the negotiated settlement is it would have to be on the bases that these Arab states had agreed, which is 242. And as I say, there's a whole chapter of my book in which I talk about 242, Security Council Resolution 242 of the 22nd of November 1967, in which basically the Palestine question is buried. Palestine doesn't exist. The word Palestine is never mentioned in 242. 242 is land occupied by Israel in 67 for peace between Israel and the Arab states. The PLO, the Palestine issue, the Palestinians are never mentioned. Just resolution of the refugee problem. Maybe they're not even decent enough to say the Palestinian refugee problem, the refugee problem.
Yeah.
So that was the basis for negotiation, which, whether they wanted to accept it or not, in 74, when they talked about a negotiated settlement, they were accepting. The PLO was accepting.
Yeah.
And they tried for years after that, for 14 years until 88, the Declaration of Independence, to wiggle out of accepting the terms of 242, which they ultimately accepted.
Do you think, so I think the 70s saw the rise of the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, embassies all around the world, Arafat being, invited to speak at the UN. Do you think that acceptance came off the basis of the strategic pivot, but also that pivot ultimately led to the divisions and the hollowing out of the PLO, among all the reasons we spoke about?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question, Senator. The victories came partly as a result of the pivot. There's no question.
Yeah.
And in my book and in my beliefs, in my understanding of events, there's no question that what the PLO managed to do from the late 60s through the early 80s marked one of the larger achievements for the Palestine cause. The Palestinians were never allowed to speak for themselves, ever in history, except in the Ottoman Parliament. That's the only time you had elected Palestinian representatives recognized. The deputy of Jerusalem, the deputies of the Jerusalem Mutasarrifit al-Quds, were the last recognized Palestinian representatives to be allowed to speak on behalf of their constituents. From then until 1974, the Palestinians don't speak. Not in 1947, when the United Nations is deciding the fate of Palestine, not anywhere during the British Mandate, certainly not in 67. 1967, a resolution is passed which is intended to bury permanently the Palestine question and the Palestinians. Okay? So this is an achievement. There's no question. It's not just a matter of embassies. It's a matter of the Palestinians have not just a right to speak, but they have a cause, and that cause is part of it, has to be addressed. So that part of it is a victory, but that's bought at a price. Part of the price, I think you put your finger on. And it's worth going into this a little bit. Sure. What the PLO accepted in 1974 was not just effectively 242 or an international negotiation which would require compromises. They accepted an international consensus that went back to 1947, which is that a Jewish state in Palestine was legitimate. The partition resolution was really intended to create Israel. It was not intended to create an Arab state. And the result proves it. No Arab state was created. Britain, Israel, Jordan, the United States, the Soviet Union had no intention whatsoever under any circumstances of allowing the creation of a Palestinian state, and they didn't. And it wasn't created, and it wasn't intended. They were intending to achieve a certain goal for Zionism, which is to turn a Jewish national home promised by the British into a Jewish state. That's what partition did, okay? The Palestinians in 1974 were in effect accepting that international consensus. It wasn't until 88 that they formally said that. That's what was in the back of their minds. And I think it's worth looking at that consensus. This is not just the Americans and imperialism and Zionism and reaction formed up that consensus. Every country in the world, the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc at that time, the Third World, they all accepted the idea of legitimacy of Israel. And so the PLO was accepting an international consensus that goes back to 1947, or you could argue goes back to the British Mandate, goes back to the League of Nations Permanent Mandate Commission, the League of Nations giving a mandate for Palestine with specific terms to Britain. So the Palestinians were making a huge concession at that point, whether they fully realized it or not. The opponents of this shift in 74 understood it, but I'm not sure everybody else did.
Yeah, it's very interesting, to have that put into perspective, because I think a lot of people forget that our national movement's objectives were always formalized or formed in relation to the region, the Arab states, who always interfered in Palestinian politics. I mean, obviously Europe, the US, and Israel. And so at this juncture of our national movement, where it's on its deathbed, we face a lack of articulation of where we're going in the next phase and what that national objective is. I want to put a pin in that just for a second, because a big part of the conversations we have on the series are about Palestinian identity. And a big part of what we're trying to do is trying to showcase Palestinians from all around the world doing really cool, amazing things. And, you wrote the book on Palestinian identity. And one thing I wanted to ask you is why? Why did you feel the need to write that book?
That's a good question. I have to put myself back in the early 90s, which is when I wrote it, or when I did the research and wrote it. I was operating in an American academic environment. And if you go back to when I was a student in the 60s, or when I came back to the States in the 80s or 1983, Palestine had been effectively removed as a legitimate subject of discourse. It was a dirty word to identify yourself as Palestinian in the United States. This wasn't so true in Europe, but it certainly was true in the United States. It wasn't true in the Third World, but it was true in the United States. Was to mark yourself as an undesirable. So the very topic was, to some extent, taboo. And there was a meretricious, false, hostile narrative which said that there was no such thing as Palestinians. The Golda Meir remark of 1969.
Yeah.
Famous, there are no Palestinians. And so I wasn't consciously or directly responding to that, but that was the environment in which I was writing and thinking. Today we have probably 100 books on Palestine appear every year, scholarly and non-scholarly, in English in the United States. Mm-hmm. Novels, memoirs, poetry, plays, essays, writing from Palestine, anthropology, history, political science, at least 100. I mean, I get these books, I get more, but I can't read them all. I'm completely incapable of following branches of literature on Palestine because there's so much that's coming out. So today in 2020, Palestine is a perfectly legitimate subject. In fact, in some branches of the academy, it's fashionable, even, which is not a positive thing, by the way. But in the 80s, that wasn't the case. The Palestine question had changed in its nature. There was a little more sympathy for the Palestinians than there had ever been. Israel's siege of Beirut started that process. The first Intifada had an enormous positive effect. But you still had entrenched views about Palestine. And there was also a shift in the way in which nationalism and identity were being understood in the 80s and early 90s when I was writing. From the sort of essentialist, the identity of the French people goes back to the Gauls, and the identity of Israel goes back to the Bible, and whatever. And the Palestinian version of this is we're Jebusites and Canaanites and Philistines and so on and so forth. Complete and utter nonsense, in fact, all of it. No truth in it whatsoever. It's important to the national myth, but it's not actually true. And that new set of theories talked about nationalism and identity as constructed, talked about in Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, and so on and so forth. And I had been teaching and reading some of these things, and I said, well, this certainly applies to the Palestinians. It obviously applies to Zionism. It applies to Turkish nationalism. It applies to almost all modern nationalisms, as it applies to British and French and German nationalism. And when I teach these things, I tell people, the English chose a Dutchman to rule them in 1688. So what are you talking about when you talk about nationalism in England? And they chose a German to rule them in 1720. Why? Because they were Protestants. It had nothing to do with nationality or language. George I didn't even speak English. They didn't care. He was a Hanoverian. He came from Germany. So this idea of some kind of echt, essential rootedness, Henry V in the famous play, once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, and he marries Catherine of France. They spoke French, the British aristocracy in those years, in the early 15th century. Henry was the one who started the use of English in the British Chancery. So these ideas of nationalism going back to, the time of the Romans is complete nonsense. It's nonsense as far as Zionism is concerned. It's also nonsense as far as Palestine is concerned. So I was buried in an archive and reading stuff that showed that there are forms of identity that later form, there are components of Palestinian identity that are pre-existing. Family, religion, loyalty to place, the fact that some of us have names, Maqdisi, Nabilsi, and so on and so forth, Masri, Dimashqi, and so on, shows that there's a rootedness in place. And I went in this book through those elements of identity, and I showed how that developed into Palestinian identity towards the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think mostly to the point that also, a big part of the Zionist argument is, well, there is no such thing as a Palestinian people or a Palestinian state. Go back to Jordan, still something that we hear every day today.
Of course.
And it's essential. One thing I want to relate back to our conversation about national strategy. At this moment, you have 13 million Palestinians around the world. We're extremely diverse in our national identity. We all identify on some level as Palestinian. But at some juncture, there was a national strategy and vehicle that brought us all together, whether it was PLO and the armed struggle. What do you think those two components could be today that can tap into and try to bridge Palestinian fragmentation?
I mean, now you're taking me out of my area of expertise and you're asking me to speculate. And I'm happy to do that. But I'm no more qualified than any citizen to give you an answer to that question. I think that you're right in saying that our national movement, the Palestinian national movement, is in a state of disintegration. Mm-hmm. There is absolutely no Palestinian strategy. The strategies, the two bankrupt strategies of Ramallah and Gaza are a joke. Nobody seriously believes that Palestine is going to be liberated through firing a few rockets from Gaza, which in fact the authorities in Gaza are mainly trying to prevent. And nobody believes that anybody is going to take Abu Mazen and his diplomacy seriously. Nobody even talks to him. I mean, they do it as a matter of courtesy if they do. So there's no diplomacy, there's no strategy, and there's no armed struggle, and there's no strategy. There's self-preservation of individual and elite interests, and that's all there is. So we're in a state of disintegration. It's not the first time in Palestinian history that that was the case. It happened again in the wake of the Nakba after 1948, and it's happened before, and it is a problem that's different now because of the situation of Palestine. Israel hasn't stood still while the Palestinian national movement was being hammered at different stages. The colonization of Palestine has never really stopped since it began back in the late 19th century in a very limited form through the steroids. It's been on steroids certainly since the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So you have a doubly difficult problem. All of historic Palestine is under absolute Israeli control. There's one sovereignty between the river and the sea, and there will be only one sovereignty for the foreseeable future, one security authority, one population register, one control over water. Everything important is in the hands of the Israeli state. So the Palestinians have to figure out a strategy that deals with these new realities. And they have to figure out how to unite, as you suggested, these various disparate parts of the Palestinians. Well, the Palestinians in Chile, the 250,000 or 500,000, however many there are, there's a lot of them. I've been there. There are a lot of them. They're everywhere. Yeah. Palestinians in the United States, the Palestinians in the different Arab countries, and so on and so forth. And then the almost or about half of the Palestinian population that lives inside historic Palestine and is chopped up into segments. The ones in Jerusalem, the ones in Israel, the ones in the West Bank, the ones in Gaza, all in different situations. And even within Israel, the people in the Nakab are in a different situation than the people in the Triangle, who are in a different situation to others in the cities, for example, in Haifa, or in Lid, or in Jaffa, or whatever it may be. So that's not, that part of it, by the way, is not new. Palestinians have been divided up in different ways ever since 1947, 48. When the Nakba was underway and the disintegration of Palestinian society by the hammer blows of the Zionist militias started. So we've had that problem for 70-something years of division and separation and so on. That's not new at all. The problem is, how do you figure out a new strategy that's appropriate to the new situation that Israel has created, especially since 1967, of one sovereignty over the entirety of historic Palestine? Do you try and create an alternative sovereignty, 2 states, or do you try and change that sovereign by changing it such that you have a single democratic state or some other different form of state in all of historic Palestine? And that's actually not an easy question to answer, because both paths have enormous obstacles in front of them. To think that it will be easy to establish a sovereign Palestinian state, given that Israel since 1967 has done everything possible to make that absolutely out of the question. That was Israel's primary objective. Incorporate, absorb, annex, and prevent the creation of Palestinian sovereignty, the establishment of any Palestinian state anywhere in Palestine. If we wanted to go to Jordan, take over another country, they would be happy to have us do that. But inside Palestine, no way, as far as they're concerned. And they didn't just say that. They didn't do what Palestinians have done, which is just talk. They've actually done, on the ground, everything possible to make the establishment of that state impossible. So all of that would have to be unwound. Now, that's not an impossible task. Tony Judd, the late Tony Judd, once said, "What any politician has done, another politician can undo." The problem is this has been done over 53 years. Why has it not been asleep? Each time I go, I see the progress that this enterprise is making. So that's one problem. The other side is no easier. The structures that Zionism has created in the state of Israel and the sense of belonging to that entity on the part of Israeli Jews and the sense of superiority that they have established and the sense of entitlement and the sense that they have a right to lord it over other people. Those are just ideas, but the structures and the power of that state system that's been established would have to be eroded in ways that are equally hard to think about. Establishing one state in which everybody would be equal on a basis, a non-discriminatory basis, and allowing not just anybody from New York who happens to be Jewish to come, but anybody who's Palestinian in wherever they may be to come. That's going to be a huge task. There's another task involved, which is the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state internationally. That's not just Israel and the United States. Those are decisions that go back to the General Assembly Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947. That is an international consensus.
Yeah.
The wall, worldwide, not a state of Israel, a Jewish state. That was what was voted for in 181. And that is what the great powers intended. They didn't intend to establish two states in Palestine. They intended to establish one state in Palestine and devil take the hindmost. They didn't really care what happened to the Arabs. And what happened to the Arabs, we saw. Jordan took over some, Egypt took over some, Israel took over 78% of the country in 1948. So you would have to unwind, in the one case, everything Israel's done over 53 years in the occupied territories. And you'd have to unwind generations of superiority and discrimination and structures that are designed to privilege one people at the expense of another. So that it's not an easy task to pick a strategy, to pick an objective, and then figure out a strategy and the tactics to go in either one of the two ways.
I guess
that's a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No. I think it's an amazing answer, and it touches on all the complexities that I think a lot of us try to navigate. My sense was always that you need to reinvigorate the national movement. You need to rebuild an institution that can be a political system where you can participate and it's representative, democratic. And so the question I always arrive at is what can reinvigorate that national movement? What strategy can bring on the Palestinians in Naqab and Bil-Mutallat and Lebanon, Amman, everybody, again, because I think that's where our strength lies. And then the second component is because of, if we want to take 74 as an example, the achievements were made because we fit within the global consensus. And so how do we formulate then a strategy that is energizing enough that can still take on the global consensus?
Right. Those are good questions.
Yeah.
Those are good questions. I would talk about three things. I would talk about democracy. I would talk about liberation. And I would talk about the last point you made about the diplomacy of it, the international consensus. I think that the success of Israel in the United States, in the region, insofar as Palestine is concerned and on a larger scale, is intimately linked to the undemocratic nature of most regimes in the Arab world. I think that you're not going to get a perfect policy on Palestine from a democratic government necessarily, but you get an opportunity for people who are by and large sympathetic to the Palestine cause to have an effect on policy in Tunisia and Lebanon. In fact, in the countries that are more democratic or have some semblance of democracy, the Palestine cause has much greater, is much more heard, whether it's Kuwait or Jordan or Morocco or Tunisia or Lebanon. Palestine is heard in those countries in a different way than it's heard in Saudi Arabia or the dictatorships or the absolute monarchies, whether Egypt or the Gulf autocracies. And that's true of Palestinian politics as well. We had a modicum of democracy in Beirut. There was a modicum of democracy. People were heard. People, dissident voices had an impact.
Within the PLO?
Within the PLO, there was a real debate. I mean, I told you about the evacuation of Beirut, but everything from 1974, the Barnamij al-Marhali, the provisional program, whatever it was called that they adopted in 74, right through it debated and debated, not just in the Majlis al-Watani, not just in the Palestine National Council, but at every level of each tanzim, of each organization, and then in the newspapers. So you had a real debate, a Palestine-wide, Palestinian people-wide debate. The structures of the PLO were not really very democratic. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you actually had some kind of representation. That's essential. So that's the first thing, not just on a Palestinian level, on an Arab level. And I think we have to understand that democracy has to be not just the Palestinians, it has to be the region. And there's not much we can do about that, but we have to support people who are in favor of democracy. You can't say you're with Sisi. Sisi is with Israel. Sisi is with the United States. Sisi is with his own kleptocratic elite that's stealing the wealth of Egypt. You can't say you're with this or that king or sultan or emir. Those people don't represent their people. The only country that has democracy in the Gulf is, of course, Kuwait. And that's a country where you have to treat differently because they actually do have a free press. They actually have elections. They actually have a government that sometimes can stand against al-Sabah. And they have allowed the Palestinians a level of freedom up to 1991 anyway, which no other Arab country did, voluntarily. And that you still have sentiment in support of the Palestinians in Kuwait on a level you don't have in any other Gulf country. They have no relations with Israel, unlike the others who are in bed with the Israelis to a level that's horrifying if you know the details. And that's a function of absolute monarchy. You can get away with that if you're a sultan or a king or an emir. So that's the first thing, democracy. The second thing is we haven't achieved liberation. We don't have a sultan. It's a sultan, without authority, has no jurisdiction, no sovereignty, no authority. Israelis decide to dump people with COVID at the checkpoints. It does whatever it wants. They want to let in supplies, they let them in. They want to destroy a clinic, they destroy it. They want to blow up a house, they blow it up. They want to arrest people from the Jabhat Sha'bi, they do it. That myth, that falsehood, that lie, that ridiculous charade has to be dismantled. I mean, that we should govern ourselves to the extent possible on a municipal and local level, of course we should. But the idea that we have a flag no. We have to go back to the idea that we have to begin to re-begin the process of liberation, which means move your leadership outside of the Israeli jail in which Arafat and his colleagues put them into. You can't run a liberation movement from inside an area controlled by the Israeli army. That's absurd. There are no liberated zones. This is not the Sierra Mastre. This is not the Vietnamese border with China. This is Israeli-controlled, Israeli-dominated territory. Even Gaza is not free. It's not liberated. So that's the second step. We have to start thinking in terms of restarting a process whereby what we're trying to do is liberate ourselves. How and to what objective? That has to be determined. The aim and the strategy and all of that. But the mental, this ludicrous mental somnolence that we have a sultan, we have an authority, and we haven't achieved anything. Terrible, terrible mistake was made in Oslo. Many mistakes, and that's to my way of thinking the worst. This outlook, and I find it among people who oppose the sultan. They accept certain elements of the preconditions and assumptions on which the idea of the sultan is based. So that's the second thing. The third thing is the point you raised, which is we have to figure out how do you appeal to the world in a way that fits somehow within a consensus. And here's the problem that I talk about in my book. Israel is the result of a settler colonial process. Okay? The nation is still ongoing in the occupied West Bank and in Jerusalem. Israel is not the only settler colonial project which has succeeded in creating a nation state. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are settler colonial projects which ultimately were successful in creating nation states at the expense of the indigenous population. We have to figure out how to square the circle of our understanding of Israel as a settler colonial reality with the fact that they've created a people. There is an Israeli people now. Sha'ena am abena. We like it, we don't like it. The only Palestinians who are fully aware of that are the people living inside Israel. The 2 million Palestinians who, for their for their bad fortune, became citizens of the state of Israel, or for their good fortune, because they were able to stay on the land, stay inside in their homes, most of them anyway. They understand. They understand the strength and the solidity of the entity that's been created. So we have to figure out how to deal with those two realities, the settler colonial part of it and the national part of it. The Zionist movement was always both of those things. It was not an emanation of some settler colonial metropole. It was not French settlers extending the power of France into Algeria, or English settlers extending the power of the English crown into Kenya. It was a completely different kind of settler colonial project, unique actually in world history. And we have to figure out how to deal with that. They are there as a people of their own, and somehow our people and their people have to figure out how we're going to deal with this. Now, we have to figure out for ourselves first.
Yeah.
They're fine. They don't need to change anything. Status quo benefits them without exception. They have problems with us, but basically they could live on putting their boot on our neck forever. So we have to figure out what we want, and then we have to figure out how to get the boot off the neck. Mm-hmm. Not an easy process, but we have to, in doing that, understand that the fact they have their boot on their neck doesn't mean they don't exist as a people. Yeah. And that somehow or other we have to figure out how those two peoples will live in one country. It's too small. I would guess the partition. I never liked very much the idea of partition. I mean, I wouldn't say don't do it if somebody could figure out how to do it. I don't know how you could do it. But my point is, one way or another, there's two peoples there. Yeah. Whether we like it. I don't like it, but that's the way it is. If I was a Native American, I wouldn't like, the fact that people living in Manhattan, which is a Native American name, never think of Native Americans as they go about their business and treat them. But that's a reality we have to accept. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. One last thing I wanted to talk to you about is after Lebanon, you moved to the US. And was that did you directly go to Chicago then?
No. In 83, we went first to Washington, where I wrote a book on the 82 war, and we expected we would go back to Beirut after a year. When we left, things were relatively quiet. We left Beirut in August of 1983. Things were quiet. By the fall, the fighting had started again in the Shuf, in the mountains, and then it spread. And then resistance to the Israeli occupation mounted in the south, and everything changed. And so by the time I was supposed to go back in the summer of 1984, by then we had 3 children. We just couldn't have gone back. And I stayed for another year. We stayed for another year in Washington. And then I moved to New York for a couple of years. Then in 1987, I got a job at the University of Chicago. And I taught there for 16 years.
The reason I ask is I want to talk about, I think you met, President Obama while you were in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Is that right. Okay? Something we can explore and talk about? Yeah,
of course.
And I want to link it to your book, Brokers of Deceit: How the U.S. has Undermined the Peace in the Middle East. And so you obviously met him while he was there, probably a community organizer. What was he like? And
he was our state senator. He was our state senator. We lived in Hyde Park. He was our neighbor. He was my colleague at the University of Chicago, and he was our state senator, which is a pretty lowly position. Right. By the time we left Chicago in 2003, he had not even become a U.S. senator. So he was a local politician and a lecturer at the law school, and our neighbor.
And what was it? What were his positions on Palestine back then?
He had no positions on Palestine. He wasn't a national figure.
Yeah.
He ran for the House against Bobby Rush, and he was crushed. So he wasn't even a member of the House of Representatives. He was a state senator, so he had a position on the extension of I-55, or a position on state legislative issues, housing, whatever. He had no position.
Not even like on an intellectual level of like his level of awareness, his understanding.
He was aware. He was perfectly aware. He was perfectly aware. This is a man who lived in different parts of the world. very well educated, knowledgeable. He had that kind of consciousness that you get when you're, to some extent, either an immigrant or someone with a parent who's not American. He could see things that, ordinary Americans who are, monoglot, only speak one language, never heard another language in their lives, never been outside their town or city or state. He was different in that respect and open-minded and so on. But he was a politician. I mean, the fact that he ran for the House and got stomped against his wife's wishes, by the way, shows that he was thinking of higher office. And if you're thinking of higher office, you're cagey. And so he was always, careful, cagey. I think he understood. He was there. We talked about these things. He understood what was being said. But did he ever take a public position? No, not really. He didn't have to. I mean, he was a state senator. It wasn't.
Sure. But I mean,
it would have been inappropriate, actually.
Yeah. Did he show some inclination to being, pro-Palestinian or understanding the complexities that are usually absent within American public discourse on this issue?
He understood. He seemed to me, as far as we could tell, to understand some of them, certainly, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
at one point, when he ran for the Senate, we were already in New York for the U.S. Senate.
Mm-hmm.
He told my wife and a couple of our friends, when they asked him, are you going to take good positions? Now that you're going for national office, are you going to take good positions on Palestine? He said, look, you got to understand my situation here. I'm running for Senate. I need money. And this is my finance committee. And he named the people. Pritzker, Crown, he named a bunch of people. It was the Lakeshore liberals, the people who opposed the machine, the Chicago machine, which had beaten him in his race for. The Lakeshore liberals were all very pro-Israel. And so what he was basically telling them is, if I'm going to go for national office, these are the people who are going to support me. You're not going to get a word out of me on Palestine. He basically told us that, in not me. He was talking to Muna and a couple of our friends. So that was clear from the beginning. And that was and to some extent still is the politics of the Democratic Party. Democratic Party doesn't have a huge grassroots, a powerful lobby favorable to Israel. There are many, many, many Democrats who are favorable to Israel, but it has a lot of big donors who are favorable to Israel, a lot of leading figures in the party who over time have become favorable to Israel, so that the party machine, as a general rule, is favorable to Israel. The grassroots, in fact, has been changing ever since then. We're talking about the early 2000s, and they've become more and more and more favorable to at least open-mindedness about Palestine. But that is not the case with the top levels of the party. That's not the case with most Democratic elected officials, and it's not the case with many of the big donors to the Democratic Party.
Do you think that will change?
So in that respect, it's unlike the Republican Party, which has a mass base of evangelicals who are fanatically pro-Israel. If not $1 were contributed to the Republican Party by people who are supportive of Israel, which is not the case. Sheldon Adelson and those guys are fanatics for Israel. But even if there were not one penny coming in from a donor, the Republican Party would be, perforce, very pro-Israel because of its mass base. That's not the case with the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Well, the two questions I wanted to ask you unrelated. So I'll start with Obama, then go back to the Democratic Party. So you didn't have any high expectations of him in his career as a politician on Palestine? No.
I mean, I hoped he would be more open-minded.
Yeah.
But the other thing about him you have to understand is he's always been the kind of politician who accepts certain kinds of constraints. This is what's doable. I mean, look at him now. Follow his career as president and since. He never pushed the envelope in certain respects. He had an understanding of what was pragmatic and what was possible. He is not now and never has been a radical. He is not now and has never been a revolutionary. He is not now and never has been someone who was willing to break the ceiling on anything. Why should he have been on Palestine? I mean, I wonder about people who had these expectations of him. Are you completely blind to the person's behavior as overall? Are you completely blind to his record as a politician? I mean, when did Barack Obama challenge, basic racism? I mean, you could talk about issues that are much more important to him, on which he was very careful not to go beyond a certain point. Why, on the third rail of American politics, Israel, would he have gone? beyond that kind of careful pragmatism. I don't know why anybody should have expected it. So neither I nor most of our friends who knew him had those kinds of high expectations, and unfortunately, many other people did.
Yeah. Yeah, I was an undergraduate in the U.S. when Obama started running for office in 2007-8, and
when he started running for president.
Yeah,
I think he ran for Senate in 2004. I can't remember. He was senator for 2 years when he was elected. Sure. So he was running in 2004, 2005 for the U.S. Senate seat from Illinois.
For presidency, I should say, as a presidential candidate. Yeah, and I mean, I went to university in Wisconsin, so I wasn't too far from all the hoopla, and saw that. Yeah, I mean, on some level, as a young man, you see that historic presidency in some ways, and then also you attach some sort of expectations to that. Obviously, I couldn't have known him personally. And then throughout the years, it's just a sequence of disappointments on Palestine.
Right. Well, the disappointments haven't ended.
No. The last thing I wanted to touch upon was the Democratic Party and its evolution, and the grassroots within the Democratic Party becoming more favorable of Palestine. And you see now some of progressive candidates representative of the grassroots penetrating, national politics like AOC or Bernie or Ilhan or Rashida. Where do you think that will take us, and what does that mean for Palestine?
Well, first of all, I think that the Biden candidacy is a guarantee that to some extent the status quo in the party will continue, which is to say that the party elite, the party leadership, the party machine, the Clinton, Schumer, Pelosi party, which is also the Obama party. The people who dominate it, the people who run it, the people who make the decisions, Tom Perez, all of those people, are going to have, assuming that the Democrats win in November, which is open for discussion. The status quo to some extent will continue. And the status quo is one where the party leadership basically stifles the base. Now, the base has been moving and moving and moving on this issue. We saw it at the convention in 2016. This is not a new process. Resolution on Jerusalem and many other things. And it's gotten even more prominent with the development of a much more stronger progressive caucus in the House. A lot depends on the House elections and the Senate elections. I mean, independent of the presidency, if you have a President Biden and you have a Democratic majority in the Senate and you have several more progressives added to the House Democratic majority, that gives you one set of outcomes and one set of possibilities. The Republicans winning in 2020 means something else. It probably means a radicalization of the Democratic Party in a favorable direction as far as Palestine is concerned. But all of us are in the wilderness for another 4 years of disaster. Not just for Palestine, for the world, for the United States, for the economy, for the pandemic. I mean, the most incompetent, rapacious, ignorant, blind, know-nothing group in American history since the Know-Nothing Party are now in power. And if they stay in power, we're in real trouble. All of us, the world is in real trouble. Anyway, I think a lot depends on the results of those elections. And it's going to be so much harder for challengers to establishment Democrats to win in 2020, given the pandemic, than it was in 2018, 2016. And this progressive group in the House has been built up over time. You actually have several dozen people who will vote for something that is fundamentally opposed by AIPAC. You didn't have that 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So you're right that change is underway. A lot will depend on what happens in 2020, whether it continues. At the grassroots, it will continue because younger people who are the base of the Democratic Party, minorities, another base of the Democratic Party, younger people in the Jewish community, another base. I mean, every segment, liberal churches, I mean, you can go, the unions, all of them are evolving on Palestine in a positive direction. And that will continue irrespective of what happens at the froth level of national politics. Will that have an impact on national politics? A lot will depend. A lot will depend on what deals the Sanders wing of the party is able to make with the Biden people if Biden wins in terms of policy. Biden has already tailored some of his policies to fit a more progressive outlook of that powerful wing of the party. But in the end, it's the Biden people, it's the establishment people who are going to form the next administration if Biden manages to win. And it's very hard to see Trump losing. He's an evil, nasty, but very capable fellow in terms of political abilities.
Absolutely. Well, we've taken enough of your time. Thank you so much for this.
Not at all.
An extremely rich conversation. It was a pleasure to
Not
have. Do you want to just mention your book quickly and where people can get it?
Sure. I don't actually have a copy of it here. I would raise it and show it to you. But the book is The 100 Years' War on Palestine. The subtitle is A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. It's published by Metropolitan Books. I can send you, Salim, a link to bookstores that you can buy it, that
that'd be amazing.
Your viewers can buy it through. So when you post the video of this, you can include a link for people to purchase it if they want.
Absolutely.
And it deals with almost every one of the topics we've talked about today, including some of the personal stuff that you asked me about.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll link that in the description below, and hopefully people go out and get it. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Thanks for doing this.
You got it. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.